Okay, here are our notes on Marxist criticism. Basically, we're going to be using Marxist criticism during our study of our first unit, The American Dream, because it applies very easily to The Great Gatsby. What criticism is basically a theory or idea that someone has created that we can then use to apply to literary text. So we're not saying that F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby based off of Marxism or anything like that, but we're taking the theories of Marx and then are going to apply them to our reading of The Great Gatsby. Something good to remember when you are working with criticism is that my reading of a Marxist reading of The Great Gatsby might be very different than your Marxist reading. I might find certain elements that I think identify with certain elements of Marxism, and you might find different ones, and that's okay. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer as long as you can make an argument that you can support. Okay, so basically, Marx in a nutshell, we have the history of all previous societies has been the history of class struggles. That is his main idea here. So his idea of Marxism focuses on class struggles and how history repeats itself with respect to that. Okay, so we might use Marxism to show how money or the lack of it affects our story. We might have a Marxist reading to show how social class affects the story, to give the poor, invisible, or disenfranchised a voice in literature. Okay, so those smaller characters that might kind of fade into the background, to really bring those people out and talk about why they're there, and to evaluate whether class and inequality is a driving force in our society and within the society within the story. Basically, Marxism is an economic philosophy revolving around who controls the wealth and how to earn wealth. Okay, so is it the workers that control wealth, or is it the bosses, or is it the women or men, or who controls that wealth? Marxism is based on Karl Marx, who is a German philosopher who lived in England. Karl Marx lived from 1818 to 1883. He was born in Germany, but he lived in England for most of his adult life, mainly because he was more accepted in England than he was in Germany. He wrote the Communist Manifesto, which is his main work, and he is widely considered one of the fathers of social science and one of the most influential thinkers of all time. Something good to know is that he was never directly involved in a communist uprising. Okay, so he had some communist ideas, and he based some of his ideas off of communism, but he wasn't involved in any of those uprisings. Some important terms that can be found in your brief guide to Marxism, but are also here that you should know and be able to use, are proletariat. Obviously, if you've read 1984, you know this word well, but that word means worker, and normally those workers are poor, but not always. The bourgeoisie are the factory owners, the capitalists, sometimes the super rich. Class struggle is pretty obvious, the inevitable struggle between the rich and the poor. Revolution is the violent overthrow of one government for another. Communism, we're going to talk about more in this presentation, but communism is basically the system of government that's based around economy, and socialism is the economic system that communism uses. In communism, basically it's a command economy, which means there's a complete share of possessions and property. There's no religion, no class structure, and ideally no government is necessary. So the goal is pure social equality. In Marxist theory, the harder workers work and the more money they make for their bosses, the poorer they become. And I know that sounds weird when you look at it, that the harder you work and the more money you make, how could you possibly be becoming poorer? However, the idea is that if you're working harder and harder for someone that's your boss, basically by the harder that you work, you're putting this boss person more and more above you, and therefore you're allowing them to continue to objectify you in the position that you're in. Eventually, according to Marxist theory, workers will tire of this and overthrow their masters. The workers will then take control of the means of production and the government. And according to Marxist theory, all of history can be seen through the lens of class struggle and reform. Basically, in true communism, a government isn't needed. However, normally after this overthrow, a communist system will be put into place with a temporary government. And ideally, that temporary government would eventually dissolve, which would leave a perfect communist state where everything functions perfectly and everyone makes the exact same amount of money doing the exact job that they want. It sounds very ideal, right? Okay, so what does this have to do with American Lit in our class? Basically, when someone critiques through a Marxist lens, they're focusing on how money and power affects the story, who has it, who doesn't have it, including the author, how it solves or causes problems, and to what degree class conflict affects the society. Also, we look at class struggle, rich versus poor, working and living conditions, and the ability to move up the economic food chain. So that's something we're going to talk about a lot in our society and in the society of the text that we read. Is it possible for you to go from being at the very bottom of the food chain or the bottom of society to the top? And we'll look at social class with the workers and the capitalists. When you are doing a Marxist reading, you want to ask yourself the following questions. So, how does the author deal with the poor in relation to the rich? Do poor characters dream of a better life? If so, how do they act on them? How long have the poor been poor? Does the author create sympathy for the poor or hatred for the upper class? Are the poor being exploited? And can the poor become rich with or without violence? Remember that we did do a Marxist reading of that commercial in class, the Audi commercial about prom, so you can always go back to your notes on that, as well as your brief guide to Marxism if you're wanting to look back at some notes on Marxism. Thanks!